You're standing in a valley in what is now eastern Turkey. It's around 3300 BC. The sun is low, the air smells of smoke, and a man is holding something no human has ever held before. It's long, it's metal, it catches the light like water. It isn't a knife, and it isn't a spear. It's the first sword on Earth, and here's the strange part. He didn't make it to hunt a deer. He didn't make it to chop wood or dig a root. He made it for one reason only, to kill another person. Think about that for a second. Long before this, humans had axes, spears, and blades, but the sword was different. The sword was the first thing we ever built that had no other job. So how did we get here? Why did it take until 3300 BC for a sword to exist at all? You'd think a sword is simple, a long piece of metal with a sharp edge. Kids draw them. But for almost the entire story of our species, a sword was physically impossible to make. Not hard, impossible. You could want one as badly as you liked. The materials on Earth would not let you have it. For hundreds of thousands of years, the smartest humans alive could not build a blade longer than a big knife. Something was stopping them, and it wasn't a lack of ideas. It was chemistry, it was the ground itself, and the answer to how we finally cracked it isn't one thing. It's never one thing. It's a chain of accidents, of new metals, of soldiers dying and smiths learning why. There are at least 6 layers to this story, and the last one changes how you'll think about every sword you've ever seen. So let's go. Let's build a sword from nothing, the way our ancestors actually did, one hard-won step at a time. Here's what nobody tells you about early weapons. For most of human history, we didn't cut things. We smashed them. Your oldest ancestors, the ones a million years back, worked in stone, and stone is brutal for making a blade. You can nap a sharp edge onto flint, yes. A hand axe, a spear point, a scraper. Those are short, thick, and stubby. But try to make stone long and thin, like a sword, and it snaps the moment you use it. Stone has no give, it shatters, so the length of your weapon was capped by the material. Nature had drawn a hard line, and for a million years, nobody could cross it. That's not a small detail. That's the whole reason the sword arrives so late. A spear works as a stick with a point. A knife works short, but a sword needs to be long, thin, and still survive being swung at another human as hard as you can. Stone simply cannot do that. Wood can't either. Bone can't. To get a real sword, you needed a material that had never existed on the surface of the earth in a usable form. You needed metal, and finding metal was its own strange journey. The first metal humans really used wasn't strong at all. It was copper. Around 9,000 years ago, people in the Middle East noticed that certain greenish rocks, when heated in a hot fire, would weep shiny beads of a new substance, copper. You could hammer it, bend it, and it wouldn't shatter like stone. That felt like magic. Here's the problem, though. Pure copper is soft, really soft. You could make a copper knife, swing it once, and watch the edge fold over like a warm spoon. So copper gave us the dream of a metal blade. It just couldn't give us a blade that actually worked in a fight. Then came the accident that changed everything. Somewhere, some smith added another metal to the melted copper. Sometimes it was arsenic, pulled from the same ores. Later, it was tin, and the mix that came out was harder, tougher, and held an edge far better than copper alone. We call it bronze. Bronze is the hero of this entire story. Add a little tin to copper, and suddenly you have a metal you can pour into a mold. A metal hard enough to take a real point and a cutting edge. And a metal that won't fold on the first swing. For the first time ever, a long, thin blade could exist. The door to the sword had finally opened. And bronze gave you a second gift that stone never could. You could pour it, heat bronze until it runs like thick honey. And you can pour it into a carved mold shaped exactly like a blade. When it cools, you lift out a rough sword in one piece. Think about how wild that is. A stone tool had to be chipped away, flake by flake, hoping it didn't crack. A bronze blade could be cast in an afternoon, then hammered and ground to a razor edge. That meant you could make swords faster and make them match. For the first time, a warrior band could carry blades that all looked the same. The sword wasn't just possible now, it was repeatable. And someone walked straight through it, in that valley in Turkey. The oldest swords we've ever found come from a place called Arslantepe, a mound near Malatya in eastern Turkey. In the 1980s, an Italian team led by archaeologist Marcella Frangipani dug up a cache of 9 blades. When they dated them, the result stunned everyone. These swords were made around 3300 BC. That's 5,000 years ago. They were forged from arsenical copper, an early bronze, and they run about 45 to 60 centimeters. Long, not knives, not daggers, swords. And here's the detail that gives you chills. 3 of them were decorated with silver inlays. Silver inlays. Stop and think about what that means. The very first swords ever made were not just tools. Someone bothered to make them beautiful. You don't inlay silver into a thing you plan to use once and throw away. You do that for an object that means something. Power, rank, maybe kingship. So right at the birth of the sword, we see the 2 faces it will wear for the rest of history. A weapon in one hand and a symbol in the other. Before this find, most experts thought swords only appeared around 1600 BC. Arslan Tepe pushed the sword's birthday back by more than 1,000 years in a single dig. But let's be clear about something. Those first Arslan Tepe blades were a beginning, not a finished machine. Early bronze swords had a serious weakness, and warriors paid for it in blood. The problem was toughness. A lot of early bronze swords were built to stab, long and narrow, like a metal needle. Fencers today would call them rapiers, and against a soft target, they were deadly. But bronze, this shape was too soft to survive blade-on-blade contact. Block another sword hard, and yours could bend or the hilt could rip clean off. The weak point was where the blade met the handle. Early swords were often just riveted onto a wooden grip, and those rivets sheared under a real blow. Imagine that in a fight. You swing with everything you have. You connect, and instead of cutting your enemy, your blade snaps at the handle and you're standing. They're holding a stick. That happened a lot. So for centuries, smiths chased one goal above all others. Make the sword survive the hit. Not just cut, not just stab, but take a full force blow and stay in one piece. And slowly, blow by broken blow, they figured it out. This is where the sword stops being a fragile luxury and starts becoming the weapon that would rule battlefields for the next 3,000 years. And here's something worth pausing on. The person who could actually make these blades became one of the most important people in the whole society. Think about it. Most people knew how to gather food or build a shelter. Almost nobody knew how to find the right ores, mix the right amounts, hit the right temperature, and pour a blade that wouldn't fail. That knowledge was rare, and it was power. In many ancient cultures, the smith was treated as half magician, someone who pulled shining weapons out of dull rock and fire. Kings kept them close. Myths were built around them. The god of the forge shows up in culture after culture, from the Greeks to the Norse. Because to early humans, making a sword really did look like magic, and whoever held that magic held the future. The first big fix came around 1300 BC, and it was clever. Smiths started adding a bulge, a widening, about 2/3 of the way down the blade. It gave the sword a leaf shape. Why does a bulge matter? Because it moves weight toward the tip and changes the balance. That extra mass out near the end turns a swing into a chop. Suddenly, the sword could deliver a heavier, more punishing blow without shattering. It was the difference between poking someone and actually cleaving into them. A small change in shape, a huge change in what the weapon could do. The sword was learning how to hit. Then came the real breakthrough. The one that mattered most. Around 1200 BC, a design spread across Europe that historians call the Nowy Type II, and it fixed the fatal flaw. Instead of riveting the blade to a separate wooden handle, the Nowy II extended the metal of the blade itself all the way through the grip, with raised flanges along the edges to hold. Wooden plates. The whole thing was basically one continuous piece of metal from tip to pommel. That junction that used to snap, now it was solid. The historian Anthony Snodgrass called it the first true cut-and-thrust sword. You could slash with it and stab with it, and it would take the shock and hold. Here's how good that design was. Warriors could now swing the Nowy II hard enough to take off a head, an arm, or a leg in a single stroke. And that's not a metaphor. That's what these blades did on real battlefields. The design worked so well that it stayed in use for something like 500 to 700 years. Read that again. One sword design in service for over half a millennium. It was so right that when humans switched from bronze to iron, they barely changed the shape. They just made the same sword out of a new metal. When you get the engineering that correct, you don't argue with it. You copy it for centuries. Now, about that new metal. Because iron is where the whole story turns again, in a way you might not expect. You'd assume iron beat bronze because iron is stronger. That's the obvious answer, and it's mostly wrong. Early iron was often worse than good bronze. Softer, more brittle if you got it wrong. Harder to work. So why did iron take over the world? One reason. Iron ore is everywhere. It's one of the most common things in the ground. Bronze needs tin, and tin is rare and scattered. To make bronze weapons, you needed long-distance trade networks just to get the ingredients. Cut that supply, and your whole army goes unarmed. This is the part that quietly reshaped human society. Because bronze was expensive and rare, bronze swords belonged to elites. Kings, nobles, champions. The average foot soldier never held one. There simply weren't enough to go around. But iron? Iron was cheap and local. You could arm hundreds, even thousands of ordinary men with iron blades. The sword went from a treasure carried by a handful of heroes to standard equipment for a whole army. And an army of 1,000 iron swords beats a dozen perfect bronze ones every single time. The metal didn't just change the weapon. It changed who got to be dangerous. And then humans found the final upgrade hiding inside iron itself. Smiths noticed that when iron spent time in a hot, charcoal-fed fire, something in it changed. The blade got harder, tougher, better. What they didn't know is that they were feeding carbon into the iron. An iron plus a little carbon is steel. Steel takes a keener edge, holds it longer, and springs back instead of bending. They couldn't see the chemistry, but they could see the result. So they chased it for thousands of years, refining the recipe by trial and error. Every katana, every knight's blade, every saber you can picture is the great-great-grandchild of that first accidental steel. And this hunt for better steel drove some of the most impressive craft in the ancient world. Far to the east, smiths in India learned to make a special steel we now call woots, packed with just the right amount of carbon, and traders carried it west. When it was worked into blades in the Middle East, it produced the famous watered, rippling patterns we call Damascus steel. Blades so prized that legends grew up claiming they could cut through lesser swords. In Japan, smiths folded and hammered their steel again and again, hundreds of layers, to even out the metal and produce the katana. Different cultures, different tricks, but all chasing the same dream. A blade that was hard enough to hold a wicked edge and tough enough not to snap. That balance is the entire history of the sword in one sentence. Now let's be honest about one thing, because the story isn't as clean as it sounds. The sword was almost never the main weapon of the battlefield. That surprises people. We put swords on flags and in myths and in the hands of every hero. But for most of history, the actual killing on a battlefield was done by spears, bows, and later guns. Spears are cheaper, they have reach, and a wall of them stops a charge. The sword was usually the sidearm, the backup you drew when things got close and desperate. So why does the sword get all the glory if it wasn't even the deadliest thing out there? Part of the answer is cost and closeness. A sword was expensive, personal, and hard to make, so carrying one marked you out as someone. A spear was a farm tool with a point. A bow was a hunting weapon. But a sword said only one thing about you. You were a person who fought other people, up close, on purpose. It became the mark of the warrior, the knight, the king. We put it in coronations and in oaths because it was never really about killing deer. It was always about power over other humans. And that hidden truth about what a sword is for leads us straight to the wildest part of all. There's one last thing I saved for the end, and it's the strangest truth in this entire story. Go back to that very first sword at Arslantepe, the one with silver inlaid in the blade. Ask yourself a simple question. What is a sword actually for? An axe chops wood, a knife cuts food and skins game. A spear and a bow hunt animals and fill your stomach. Every one of those tools helps you live. But a sword is useless for hunting, useless for farming, useless for building. It is too long to be a practical knife, and too bladed to be a tool. A sword does exactly one thing. It kills other human beings. Think about what that means. The sword is very likely the first object our species ever designed, whose only purpose, from the first day, was to end another person's life. Not to feed a family, not to defend against a lion, to fight other people. Every earlier weapon was a hunting tool we turned on each other in. A pinch. The sword skipped that step. It was born pointed at humanity itself. And that's why it became a symbol. That's why we inlaid it with silver, put it on thrones, and swore oaths on it. Here's the line to remember. The sword is the first tool humans made that was only ever meant for us, and people seem to feel that weight, even 5,000 years ago. Across Bronze Age Europe, archaeologists keep finding swords that were deliberately bent, folded almost in half, and then dropped into rivers and lakes on purpose. In Denmark, they found one such bent sword around 2,500 years old, ruined by hand and given to the water. Scholars think people were ritually killing the sword, ending its life the way it had ended others, offering it to the gods, a weapon so powerful that humans felt they had to hold a funeral for it. That's how much this piece of shaped metal came to mean. We buried kings with their swords. We gave them names. We wrote entire legends around single blades, from Excalibur to the swords of samurai. No spear ever got that treatment. No bow. Only the sword. So the next time you see a sword, in a museum, in a film, on a crest, remember what you're really looking at. Not just a sharp piece of bronze or steel. You're looking at the moment our ancestors crossed a line. The moment we stopped only shaping the world around us and started shaping tools aimed squarely at ourselves. It took 1,000,000 years, a lucky pinch of tin, and countless broken blades to get there. And when we finally did, we made it beautiful, and we made it terrible in exactly the same breath. That's the sword. That's us, sharp on both edges. A tool of pure destruction that we could not stop making beautiful